All right, thank you very much. As Carl indicated, my name is Barry Levine. I'm a member of and a docent at the Yankee Air Museum in Belleville, which is on the east side of the Willow Run Airport complex. If you look at the quote in the banner, if you love aviation and history, this is the place to be. I think that's a spot-on description of the museum. A guy named Chris Curran, who's one of our restoration people, came up with it on the fly, and it perfectly encapsulates what we're doing. I'll speak to you tonight about our story, past, present, and future, described in the Yankee Air Museum book up at the front of the table. Please be aware, this is a non-subtle pitch for book sales. They're available for $20. Any and all profits from royalties go to the museum, not to me. And authors' autographs available at no extra charge. If that has any cachet, I don't know. But I'll be happy to sign it to you or whoever you wanted to. I'd like to thank Carl and the Livonia Library for hosting me. Steve Hopper here from the Yankee Air Museum for logistical support. And the photo here is in our entrance to the museum. It's a Rosie the Riveter painting. A Navy guy who's retired now painted it, and I guess he does a lot of military aviation work. And he donated it to us, and it looks great. And I think it just goes to show that we've got a lot more at the museum than airplanes. Many thanks are owed to many people, including my family, Carol, Dan, and Jessica, here up in the second row. Many people associated with the museum and different historical organizations were very generous with their time and knowledge, much appreciated by me, and all this support made the book possible. Please be aware, apologies to the many people that should have been mentioned in the book but that aren't. The publisher has rigid limits on the word count, and there was no space for the entire story. Some of the key people are either deceased or in ill health, so their stories simply weren't available. I try to get it 100% accurate, as you would expect, but the nature of historical research is such that you can read 10 views of a particular event, and you'll get 10 different perspectives, and sometimes you have to do a little bit of sifting to get what you think is the truth, and somebody else might see it differently. Anyhow, I sent the text to the publisher in March of 2018, so tonight's presentation is material from the book plus updates of new events since I sent the sent it to the publisher. Before I begin, how many of you have been to the old museum, which burned to the ground in 2004, pictured here? It looks like just about everybody. How many have been to our existing museum? Very good. If you haven't, or you want to come back, me or one of the other docents will be glad to give you a tour anytime we come on through. I had known about Yankee for a long time. Took the family here back in the 90s. A great collection of artifacts and aircraft, all in a unique setting, an old World War II hangar, which you can see here. In 2004, I was living in South Canton. I saw a cloud of black smoke from our back porch in the direction of Willow Run. I thought a plane crashed at the airport. So we put on the news real quick and saw the terrible fire that took place and destroyed the original museum. The story up to then and since then is fascinating. Tons of military and aviation history, limitless dedication by many people, and ambitious plans for the future. I've been a volunteer there since 2015, and it's been a fabulous experience. How did we start? Going back to 1941 and 1942, on what had been farmland, the Ford Motor Company built the Willow Run bomber plant from scratch, and we produced 8,600 B-24 Liberator bombers there, which was a key part of the Allied arsenal. B-24s were the most produced U.S. aircraft during World War II. There were 5 plants in total that made Liberators in the U.S. Willow Run made more than any of them, where we had something like 45% of total U.S. production. This photo is from 1943 of the assembly line. This shows a small part of a 3.5 million square foot assembly plant. During the war, something like 100,000 people went through Willow Run at one time or another to work. Turnover was terrible. Working conditions were very challenging. After the war, Ford didn't want to build cars, so Kaiser Frazer took it over, and they built something like 700,000 vehicles there until they went bust in the early 50s. General Motors took it over, they built transmissions, and they turned out something like 82 million transmissions, which to my mind has to be a record for a transmission plant production under one roof anywhere in the world ever. GM, of course, had their financial problems in the late 2000s. 2010, they stopped production. And the plant was a huge presence in southeast Michigan for years, but there was no known vision for commemorating this work and the work of tens of thousands of people. That set the stage for the Yankees' 2 founding members. I know the picture's very grainy, but I couldn't find one of both these guys other than this. Dennis Norton on the left and the late Gary Bassett, 2 area guys with an interest in aviation and history. Dennis's father had worked at the Willow Run bomber plant for a short time before joining the Navy in World War II, His mom also worked at the plant. In the summer of '81, the boys got to thinking about honoring this history, and they're shown here at the Selfridge Air Museum out on the east side, another very worthwhile facility. One of their notions was, maybe we can get a Willow Run B-24 and set it up on display, have people come out and take a look. A broader, more expansive idea, get one, fly it around the area. Why not? Or maybe a museum to talk about the Willow Run story. So that summer, fall of 1981, this is all pre-Facebook, pre-email. There must have been a million phone calls to try and get things set up. We did get considerable help from the people at Selfridge. There were many things to do to open and then run a museum. It's no small undertaking to start an organization from scratch. You have to wonder if they realized what they were getting into. Our first official meeting is generally considered to be September 24th, 1981. That's essentially our birthday, and we've been at it for 38 years. If you're familiar at all with the nonprofit world, you'll be well aware it is a challenging environment in terms of getting membership, organizational issues, and funding. There's something like 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States, all doing worthwhile stuff in a wide range of areas, so there's lots of competition essentially for everything. This is an early board meeting, pretty basic boardroom. I don't see any evidence of a mahogany table here. The refreshments, some Hills Brothers coffee, a Pepsi can, somebody's having a smoke, that's about it. So these guys were not, and gals, were not living large at the time. But we're a startup organization, this is what we had. At the end of the first year, December of 1981, 206 members, and the checking account had $4,300 in it, so not much money for buying an airplane. This was the first logo, designed by a guy named Harry Terpstra, who was our past president, he's still active with our fundraising arm. He designed this particular logo. The name Yankee Air Force needed to be developed because we had no clue what to name it. Dennis had saw a Grumman AA-1 Yankee Clipper aircraft with a star on the wheel at Willow Run, and the name essentially emerged on the spot. It is not a counterpoint to what was at the time the Confederate Air Force down in Texas. Those guys are now the Commemorative Air Force. We thought about approaching the Confederates for an alliance, and we said, nope, we want to be independent, so we did not go down that avenue. We needed a building. You know, if you've been in the original museum, this is what it looked like when we got it in 1981. It was owned at the time by the Wayne County Road Commission, and they donated hangar number 2041 to us, which had been the Ford Training School during World War II, which is on the airport's east side. Dennis asked for this building thinking we might get something smaller, and the Road Commission took about 30 seconds and they said, you got it. During the war, the building had its own great history. It was used to teach GIs how to service a B-24. Training programs and materials were all built on the fly. There was essentially no airplane experience whatsoever in Metro Detroit at this time. Ford had built a couple hundred tri-motors until they gave it up during the Depression, and there were some small startup airplane companies, nothing whatsoever in the magnitude of B-24s. I've seen a variety of estimates. One was 30,000 people went through, in terms of mechanics and flight engineers, went through this building during the war. Museum volunteers went to work with lots of enthusiasm, camaraderie, and teamwork, which is carried right through to today. As you can imagine from the looks of this, it was in rough shape. Thousands of hours worth of work, virtually everything needed replacement and repair. Ice was chipped off the floor. At least one guy turned up with frostbite, and might have been a few more. And the rationale for the Road Commission giving it away became clear pretty quickly. There was a hangar committee helped by GM's hydromatic transmission plant personnel, such as plant manager George Griffith, that oversaw the rehab. Dedicated in May 1982, so about 4.5 months worth of work, the B-25 that's shown here is configured a little differently, but this ultimately became our aircraft. And here's some signage from the early days with a hangar number and the old Yankee Air Force logo. This is our first aircraft. It's an RF-84K Thunder Flash. We found this in a Belleville park. Even though it was owned by the Air Force, they essentially let Belleville have it, so kids were clamoring around on it. We lobbied with the city council, and they essentially gave it to us, so we sent some guys out with some trucks, and they towed it, hauled it, whatever they did to get it to the museum. We restored it to this finish, and the Air Force, it dawned on them what was going on. They called up one day, we want it back. So it's their airplane, so off it went. My wife and I were down there this summer, and they did a great job restoring it. Sorry to say there was no mention of the Yankee Air Museum on their logo that they have down there. This is the inside of the original hangar. If you were there, you might remember an F-105 Thunder Chief that we had on display. Excuse me. This aircraft flew in the U.S. Thunderbirds for a season. We also had a number of display rooms up on the second floor with a priceless collection of equipment, artwork, and uniforms. It's just fabulous. We've had many aviation legends come through over the years. These two fellows are Don Lopez on the left and Tex Hill on the right. Lopez flew over 100 missions in World War II in Korea, then worked as an engineer at a NASA subcontractor, then became a director at the National Air and Space Museum. Hill was a P-40 pilot in China with Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers, long service in the U.S. military, and now he's in the Aviation Hall of Fame. They're both deceased now, but we've had a lot of fabulous aviators come through. As the museum continued to operate, a constant throughout the years is showcasing a wide range of aircraft, aviation artifacts, and exhibits. One of our goals is to share with the public our nation's aviation heritage and pass the story on to future generations. It's extremely rewarding to do this. Restoration emerged as an ongoing priority dealing with these old aircraft. Our director is a fellow named Kevin Walsh, and he posed a great question. What do you restore a 50-year-old aircraft to? There's likely many different paint schemes, configurations over time. All iterations are part of the story, and the right answer isn't always obvious. What is obvious, like you can see here from this picture, is painstaking work, many different skills involved for restoration, such as paint, woodworking, electrical, metalworking, welding, and much more. Obtaining and fabricating parts is always a challenge. These things probably weren't made for 50 or 60 years, so you can't go to the manufacturer and buy new. Our museum people have done some amazing work. As an example, if you pull into today's museum, you might see off in the distance a B-52 bomber on display. On the right, this is the day that B-52 was flown here by the Air Force in October 1983. It was parked and it hasn't been moved since. The left, it's a B-52 on top. That's our aircraft landing at the Utapao Air Base in Thailand during the Vietnam War. Turns out our aircraft flew 600 missions during the Vietnam War from bases in Guam, Okinawa, and Thailand. It's often referenced to as 677 because that's part of the serial number, and that 677 is painted on the nose of the aircraft. Turns out also our aircraft flew the last B-52 mission in Laos in February 1973, even though the Paris Peace Accords were signed in late January 73, ending the conflict in Vietnam. Laos apparently wasn't in the original draft for January, so on the bombers flew, including our airplane. We're at work restoring it. Two of the guys we have at the museum, fellows named Joe Provost and Nick Consiglio, worked on this very same aircraft in their Utapao days when they were in the Air Force in Thailand. These guys have now come full circle, 50 years, and they're working on the same aircraft. It sat outside. It'd be safe to say aircraft fuselage metal in Michigan winters and summers aren't really compatible with each other, so it deteriorated. So a team effort between the museum, Utapao personnel, and students from the Myatt College of Technology in Canton are working on getting the body and the parts restored. On the left, you can see some engine work going on. On the right is a team shot. There's a work party of these Utapao veterans that live all over the country come in at least once, if not twice a year. This was from April 2019, and might be a few war stories shared, but it's a good time, and the guys work hard to get the aircraft restored. So another one of our aircraft, this is a PB-4Y2 Privateer. Privateers are the Navy version of the B-24 Liberator. This particular airframe was made out in California, it wasn't made at our plant. This airframe crashed in 1975 in British Columbia. Slides in the ocean, and the crew survived. It was dragged out of the ocean a few days later by a bulldozer. Sits outside an airport in British Columbia for 6 years, and it deteriorates and is vandalized. It was cut into pieces for truck shipment to a Michigan concern, which is asked to remain nameless, so we will honor that request. 11 truckloads worth of airplane parts. There's at work there. And it was finally donated by that Michigan concern to Yankee in 1987. Its nickname at the time was the Scrapateer, so it gives you an idea of what condition our aircraft was in. Our original crew chief was a guy named George Whitfield, who's passed away a number of years ago. He and his team worked miracles to salvage it, because a lot of people thought it was just going to end up in the junkyard. It was in such bad shape. But George and his crew put it together. The crew chief now is a fellow named Joe Amon. He and his team continue to do a fantastic job moving the project forward. Work's ongoing in an unheated, unair-conditioned hangar at Willow Run. This is the inside of a bow turret, which is one of our current projects. Our goal, to the extent feasible, is to adhere to the original turret specs and design for the privateer as a whole. We've sent people down to the Navy Museum in Pensacola for guidance as they have a privateer on display there, and it's always a scavenger hunt for parts. Funding for this work is not coming out of the museum. It's coming from a George Riley Foundation that makes this possible. Riley was a privateer crewman in the early 50s, then had a very successful career as an entrepreneur in communications and cable TV here in Metro Detroit. In fact, I think off of I-96, the public TV building's named after George Riley. He passed away in 2018, but his and his foundation's donations have made this work possible. As I mentioned earlier, one of our goals was to find a flyable B-24 that was manufactured at Willow Run and bring it here. We looked worldwide using aircraft brokers. There were some number of leads, including a sighting in Bolivia. None of those worked out. Turns out there were only 4 Willow Run bombers anywhere in the world. This one's at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. None of them are flyable and none of them are here. We did, however, over a period of years, acquire 5 flyable aircraft. Now, before I talk about our flyables, it's worth noting the terrible aviation tragedy in Connecticut earlier this month. To me, vintage aircraft flyables are a great tool for teaching history, and from a business perspective, truth be told, it's an important source of revenue for the museum. Earlier this month, Collins Foundation is a very well-regarded, very careful operation. Their B-17, the 909, which is shown here, had an engine problem on a flight in Connecticut. The pilot tried to return to the Bradley Field, lost control on landing and crashed into a building. 7 people died, including the pilot, who's Ernie McCauley, the fellow shown here. McCauley had more hours flying a B-17 than anyone in the world. Obviously, it's a terrible tragedy. The NTSB is investigating it, 12 to 18 months until the final report, so anything beyond that's just speculation. But they're working at it. They had a preliminary report that had a few facts, no conclusions. So the future of aircraft flyables, of these vintage aircraft, is an unknown. And like I say, I'm not going to speculate beyond that, but we just don't know. That said, it'd be fair to say Yankee meets or exceeds all FAA standards, pilots, maintenance, the crews, everything. So until they say no, we're going to keep them flying, as is all the other operators too. Nobody's given up on this. In terms of our aircraft, we have a C-47. This is our first flyable aircraft. It had been built in 1945 and obtained by Yankee in 1982. Had been named the Yankee Doodle Dandy. Previously flown by the Environmental Research Institute of Michigan for infrared research. 18 months worth of restoration work, and here's the aircraft at rollout after completion of this work. We repainted it in 2018, and it's now in the first Air Commando Group finish from the China-Burma India Theater in World War II. The man show there, the elderly gentleman, is named Dick Cole. He had been the last living Doolittle raider, and in fact, he was Doolittle's co-pilot on the 1942 raid in Japan. Cole then, after that, went on to fly C-47s in the Himalayas over the hump, which to me is every bit as risky as going on that Doolittle raid. Cole, like I said, was the last of the raiders. He died earlier this year, age 103. This is just taken last year, so he's 102. I'm sure I'll be pushing up daisies long before then, but he's still going. Another one of our flyables is this B-25D, built in 1943 in North American's Kansas City plant. It's one of 2 flyable D models in the world. Flew 8 missions from Corsica, which is an island off of Italy, during the war with the 340th Bomb Group. One of the bombardiers in the 340th was Joseph Heller, who went on to write after the war Catch-22 based on some of his B-25 experiences. We actually have the records of what the crews were that flew on our plane on those 8 missions. Sorry to say Heller wasn't one of them, because that really would be a neat piece of trivia, but wish it was true, but not so. The museum obtained this B-25. We began restoration work in 2000, became flyable in 2003, renamed the Yankee Warrior. A relatively recent addition here is this WACO YMF-5. Recreates the barnstorming era of aviation. It's manufactured by the WACO Aircraft Company in Kalamazoo, which was originally the Classic Aircraft Corporation. In aviation history, at least according to the company's website, so there might be an element of sales propaganda here, I don't know. Their claim is no company has ever taken a 50-year-old design and manufactured it as a new FAA-certified aircraft. So they maintain the original design, so the original WACOs look a lot like this, significant engineering and safety updates. Space for 2 passengers up front and the pilot and back. So you can see it's open air, so you would be well advised to keep your seatbelts fastened at all times during the flight. This is our flagship, the Yankee Lady. It's a B-17G, built in 1945, saw service in the Coast Guard on air-sea rescues, no World War II combat experience. It did fly in the 1969 movie Tora, Tora, Tora about Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. You might remember there's a scene in the movie where some B-17s are trying to land at Pearl, coincidentally when the Japanese attack began. This was our aircraft, although it wasn't ours at the time, was one of the flyables in those movie scenes. We acquired it in 1986 for $250,000, and as an illustration of the dedication of some of our people, 9 people took out second mortgages on their homes to guarantee the loan. Because like I say, Yankee's never been a deep pockets operation. It was flown in from Arizona with a special ferry license. Its last pre-Yankee flight was a crop sprayer. That livery is shown here. We reconfigured it to a World War II design, which is a bigger deal than it might sound because the Coast Guard and then subsequent civilian operators made many changes that we unwound. It'll be a presentation in itself to describe this restoration project. Some examples. We got 26 rolls of microfilm prints obtained from the Smithsonian to ensure accuracy. Took 9 calendar years from start to finish. The original estimate was 5 to 6 years. All electrical components with 18,000 feet of wiring were removed, tested, and replaced and repaired as necessary. About 300 people were involved. One estimate was $1 million worth of donated labor, and I easily believe it. We participate in a B-17 co-op to trade parts, which can be hard to come by. Unlikely to find this stuff on eBay or Amazon. It's a niche industry if ever there was one. There's something like 9 B-17, flyable B-17s in the world after the loss of the 909. The museum has a longstanding volunteer, Norm Ellickson, who's one of the go-to guys in the B-17 world, constantly being called for advice and guidance on how to fix these things. So it's such a small universe of people with that kind of expertise. Here's a nose art on the lady. During World War II, we don't know of any plane that was actually called the Yankee Lady during the war. But it's representative of the era where the crews might paint on somebody's wife, a girlfriend, pin-up girls from the eras like Betty Grable or somebody like that. All that led to this first flight on July 13th, 1995, when the Yankee Lady returned to the air. Couldn't find a picture for sure that was the first flight. I suspect this was later, but it gives you an idea of what it looked like. The museum has won several awards for the best and most accurate restoration of a B-17. And if you've seen any World War II film footage of air combat from a crew's perspective, then getting the B-17 fuselage, it's hard not to be moved. The casualty rate on the 8th Air Force, which B-17s were used a lot from the UK, were horrifying for all types of aircraft. Here's an artist's rendition of Life for the Waist Gunners. That doesn't look like fun. Our newest acquisition and newest flyable is this Bell UH-1 Huey helicopter. About 7,000 Hueys saw service in Vietnam, and about 3,300 were lost either to enemy action or mechanical malfunction, a very high-risk occupation. It's used for everything: troop transport, supplies, recon, medical evacuation, saving countless lives, and as a gunship. We acquired this flyable Huey in 2019, and there's a photo, I think, on arrival day in September. Our helicopter flew with the 240th Assault Helicopter Company in Vietnam. This group was known as the Greyhounds, and you can see the Greyhound logos on the side. If you recall the old Greyhound bus advertising tagline, "Leave the driving to us," that's what these guys adapted for the 240th. We'll have rides available in 2020, thereby becoming our 5th flyable. Of course, to fly aircraft, you need ramp crew, maintenance, scheduling, flight operations, and pilots. It's a tremendous behind-the-scenes effort to keep them flying, which may not be obvious to our passengers. Pictured here are 2 of our pilots, Tony and Delane Buttacavoli. Tony's a retired Marine infantry officer. He now flies cargo planes for a living, and he pilots our C-47. Delane's a first officer with Southwest Airlines. She flies a B-25. It has to be one of the very few, if not only, husband-wife teams flying vintage warbirds anywhere in the world. And you can see we've got the next generation right on the way. I don't think they've let the kids fly the planes yet, but I haven't been up in the cockpit, so who knows. Anyhow, this is a picture of the museum in 2004, and it's really the end of the first era of the Yankee Air Museum. Disaster struck on Saturday, October 9th, 2004. Fire started on the second floor. Cause has never definitely been established. I've heard a couple of theories and rumors, but that's all they are theories and rumors. I did talk to a Van Buren fireman in 2017 who was on the call, and he said it was absolutely the worst fire he's been on in his entire career. Building, all contents were lost, but it could have been worse. No one was seriously hurt, although there was some smoke inhalation. Aircraft stored outside weren't damaged. The wind direction was away from the fuel farm, so obviously a huge, huge stroke of good luck. Volunteers on hand that afternoon, at some risk to their personal safety, pushed and towed out the C-47 and B-17. If these were destroyed, to me, I don't see how the museum would have survived the loss of the B-17 in particular. One of our guys, he's still with the museum, is a fellow named Barrett Vance. He had been working on the B-17 that day, and he left a tow bar on the airframe, thinking he'd come back Sunday or Monday to finish up and move it out. Well, that act alone just might have saved the museum unknowingly, because that really facilitated, again, the tractor. We have a little tug tractor thing, and it pulled it out and saved the plane. Some museum people were on site late that night looking at the wreckage. And what on earth could you have been thinking, all those countless hours of work literally gone up in smoke? Word went out, this is on Saturday night, let's meet the next day, Sunday, and decide what to do. Certainly would have been plausible to just call it quits and say, hey, we're done. They met in what was a Maya College building, and there was decisive agreement to rebuild. On the 10th, the next day, the B-25, which was outside, it had just landed, I think, about when the fire broke out, flew overhead on a previously scheduled trip. Someone on board took this picture, and it was told me more than one person was crying on the ground seeing the B-25 at work. Maya and Willow Run were very helpful in terms of providing space, phones, and support after the fire. Saw a DVD of a press conference a week after the fire, already developing recovery plans. Donations were coming in from around the world. We're back in business. Word spread in the aviation community. One of the aircraft we lost was an OV-10 Bronco, which is shown here. It was an Army NASA prototype used for slow flight research, so it's really a unique, one-of-a-kind aircraft. OV-10 Bronco Association member wrote, while the loss of so much irreplaceable history at the museum is heartbreaking, we know it's not as simple as game over. The volunteers that keep museums such as the Yankee Air Force going are not easily deterred by adversity. We look forward to the Yankee Air Museum rebuilding with an even bigger and better facility and collection, which is exactly what happened. So we had a nomadic existence for several years, different buildings in the Willow Run complex. We ultimately bought that Maya facility where we had the day after the fire meeting, moved in October 2010, 6 years to the day after the fire. This photo is undated, but it's pretty early on. I'd stopped by in 2011 and took a look, and I thought these guys are going to be gone in 6 months. There was nobody there, no aircraft, no nothing. And you can see it's pretty slim pickings. Happy to say I was 100% wrong. We were continually adding aircraft, artifacts, and exhibits, about 28,000 square feet of gallery space, and we're just flat out of capacity right now. As the museum grew larger, Yankee Air Force name was gradually retired in the late 80s and early 90s. Excuse me. The Michigan Aerospace Foundation was formed in 2001 to coordinate fundraising. It's now doing business as the Yankee Air Museum Foundation. The fellow with the microphone there is Kevin Walsh, named Executive Director in 2012. He has a high-stress, high-pressure position, always upbeat, positive, and he's a real force for good. He's got a couple hundred volunteers that probably tell him every day how to run the museum, and I've probably piped in with a few suggestions of my own from time to time, but it's doing a great job. We've changed to a named board where we have members with specific areas of expertise to provide strategic direction. We've considered several alternatives for a future home. We ended up buying the last 144,000 square feet of the Bomber plant in 2014 from GM's real estate disposal team. We looked at some other alternatives in the Willow Run complex, and none of them had the historic significance of the Bomber plant. That led to the Save the Bomber Plant fundraising campaign to renovate our future home. It was a very costly proposition, with more on this later. Of course, we have aircraft. As an aviation museum, as you would expect, this is an AH-1J COBRA. This type of helicopter was used extensively in Vietnam and then variants for years afterwards by the military. The museum's COBRA saw stateside service with the Marines, so ours wasn't in Vietnam. First helicopter in the world designed exclusively as an attack helicopter. Chief designer was a guy named Mike Folst on a Bell helicopter in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Found a 2014 article where Folst said he was still receiving emails and letters saying, "Your helicopter saved my life." and that our guys would be pinned down by North Vietnamese forces. They'd call in for reinforcements. The Cobras would come out and chase away the Cong. All good. Unlikely many in the workforce today get the sort of recognition that Fultz does. We have a Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, this one in particular. Our aircraft saw service in World War II in Operation Torch off of North Africa in 1942. Then it was on anti-submarine patrols in the Atlantic in 43. Rotates back to the U.S., engine installed on a carrier takeoff and a training exercise in Lake Michigan in October 43. This off a steamer retrofitted with a carrier deck, 25 miles off of Chicago. The pilot is a fellow named Bill Kirkbride. He survived, although the Dauntless was absolutely demolished. See, the cockpit just flattened. We recovered it from the lake floor in 1994. It's seen coming ashore, courtesy of the A&T Recovery. The T is a fellow named, the A&T is a fellow named Taras Lysenko. And the Dauntless will be displayed upside down as it was found on the lake floor. This is what you're going to see. Exhibit's called Deep Landings. This is early in 2018, where it's all dolled up now. We got some computer simulators, artwork, it's painted, it looks a lot, the display looks a lot better. That's what the airplane's going to look like. When I first saw it, I said, that's what we're going to show people? Like, it's not much. But when you know the story about the training and the carriers and Kirkbride and what happened and the hauling up out of Lake Michigan, it's a great story, and I've showed this to a number of guests. They love it. They absolutely love it just the way it is, so good call. And in any event, we didn't have the money and tooling to fix it up anyhow, but so it all worked out good. We're not just airplanes, as you would expect. The aircraft have tons of human interest stories. We've had, for example, local TV personality Sonny ELIOT on hand. He had been a B-24 pilot over Europe, shot down, spent 18 months as a POW in Stalag Luft 1. Turns out he organized plays and skits for the other POWs in camp as a morale builder. And I can assure you, life for the POWs was not Hogan's Heroes, which I have to confess I religiously watched in the 60s as a kid, but he wasn't dealing with Colonel Klink. We've also had Alex Jefferson out. He's from Detroit, one of the Tuskegee Airmen. He flew P-51 Mustangs and other aircraft from bases in Italy. Jefferson was shot down and became a POW. He's treated just like any other POW by the Germans, which was not so because he's black, before or after the war here at home. Comes home, gets into education, becomes a teacher and then an assistant principal in Detroit. One of the founders of the Tuskegee Airmen Museum in Detroit. He received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007, as did all the other Tuskegee Airmen. And we have a display of Tuskegee Airmen artifacts on display with additional material being donated from the Kalamazoo Air Zoo. Another speaker was Paul Galanti, who was here at the museum in 2017. Our A4C, the aircraft on the right, is finished in Galanti's honor. You might not be able to see it from your seat, but if you come to the museum, you can see Galanti's name painted under the canopy. He flew 97 missions in Vietnam. Shot down, spent 6 years as a POW, brutally abused, as you would suspect, by his North Vietnamese captors. He spoke about how he kept his head on straight in this hellhole. So his faith kept him going. He contemplated suicide, and then he had a religious epiphany. He said, you know what? I've got a higher purpose than to let these guys get me down. His self-discipline, he had gone to the Naval Academy, so he had been a midshipman and a plebe, and he put up with all the nonsense down there. That self-discipline worked wonders in dealing with the North Vietnamese. And then he had a positive attitude, thinking somebody else has it worse than me, although you hear him say that and you say, really? Who? He also has a saying that I have taped up in my office at work. There's no such thing as a bad day when you have a doorknob on the inside of a door. It's a good reminder how easy life is here for all of us here in the United States. We have had air shows for years, Thunder over Michigan every August. We started using the Thunder name in 2003. It had various formats before that. This is the Willow Run Air Show. I think the picture's 85 or thereabouts. Have an ongoing effort to keep it fresh with different themes every year. 2019 featured Corsairs, which we used extensively in World War II and Korea. Corsairs on the bottom left. We'll have the Blue Angels here in 2020. Super impressive to see, especially close up. I work every year, I work the air show at the museum, so I have a bird's eye view of what's going on. It's fabulous. It is a high-risk profession. There have been a number of fatalities among the Angels as well as the Air Force Thunderbirds over the years at various shows and in practice missions. You have to think perfection is the only acceptable standard for the pilots and ground crews. We also support an effort with the Make-A-Wish Foundation. when the Angels or Thunderbirds in town. One of our volunteers, Melissa Bruce Frutos, she's a woman in the center, coordinates this effort where 10 families supported by Make-A-Wish come in and meet the pilots and the crews on the Friday before the show. Very careful planning is required to minimize stress, as there are some very sick kids with families under tremendous pressure, as you might expect. To me, if you can give a sick kid and their family some hope, you've done a good deed, and our team has done many, many good deeds over the years. Another key museum effort is to support the Willow Run Tribute Rosies, who honor the female defense plant workers in World War II. On the left is a Rosie at work at Willow Run. Working in the defense plant such as Willow Run was dangerous, it was hot, it was loud, substandard housing in the area at the time because there was no housing in that part of Ypsilanti until the war, and the government threw up these tar paper shacks. It was horrible, just horrible. Little evidence of ergonomic design in the plant. The riveters, as you can see here, installed 400,000 rivets plus per B-24 with absolutely zero participation by robots because they didn't exist. So all human beings. Rosie the Riveter is now in the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, signifying the pivotal effort of female defense workers to the war effort. On the right is the Willow Run Tribute Rosie team at the Washington, D.C. for a National 4th of July parade. I think this was in 17 or 18 maybe. These women attend numerous events and parades and give many talks each year highlighting Rosie's extensive contribution to winning World War II and the many challenges they face. They are a super ambassador for this cause. A few words about the driving force behind the museum. This is our founder, Dennis Norton, shown in 2014. Dennis would say that the work of thousands of people since 1981 have made the museum what it is today, and he's right. In my opinion, it would also be right to say no Dennis, no museum at all. He's been at it 38 years, and he's outside business interests. He's raised a family, so he has many other things to occupy his time in addition to the bomber plant. Continues to remind us of the importance of Detroit and the bomber plant as part of World War II's arsenal of democracy right here in Detroit. Dennis's many contributions were recognized with his 2018 induction into the Michigan Aviation Hall of Fame. I'd like to especially mention the many museum guests that are either Vietnam veterans, their family, or their friends. We're at a point, as you all know, the World War II guys essentially are all gone. And the Korean guys aren't far behind them. So the Vietnam guys are like, if you will, the elder statesmen among the military. The sandbag display was originally built by the Ann Arbor Vietnam Vets chapter, and they signed the bags as like saying, look what we did. Now, any Vietnam vet that comes in is welcome to do so. It's really moving to see. First guy I had sign a bag. I was on a tour, and we got to talking. He was in Vietnam, and he said, here, if you want a magic marker, feel free to sign. He said, it's no big deal. He was just a truck driver. I told him I respectfully disagreed with his conclusion. He was there, he was in country, he was at risk, so it's a very big deal. The barrel represents Agent Orange. We use it as defoliant, and the troops were told there were no ill effects on human beings, even though it wiped out the vegetation there. Now, it would reasonably think, at best, that was naive optimism, and at worst, it's just bald-faced lie by the military to our troops. The literature and stories from many of our guests show both the PTSD from the war and Agent Orange health effects are still with us, and you can only imagine the effect on the Vietnamese population. People are surprisingly open about personal matters. I gave her a tour to a group once. One woman in the group told me about her father. He said for years, Dad would never talk about his combat service in Vietnam. He just clammed up, wouldn't say a word. He's getting older now. I guess he's got some health issues. And he's opening up, but his emotions aren't well regulated. So going 1 minute from talking, he's yucking it up, they went on leave, and they tore up Saigon, and this and that, and then sobbing 2 minutes later about what he remembered from the war. So clearly, I had no idea what to say to this guest, but it leaves an impact. I'll leave any interpretation of U.S. involvement in the war to you, and what we did and did not do. Obviously, we're not running poli-sci 101 there, so guests come to their own conclusion, but it still looms large with us. I think that's fair to say. We have some challenges to deal with. We've got aircraft in multiple locations. This is the inside of Hangar 1, which houses our flyable aircraft. Wayne County Airport Authority is suspending aviation operation in 2020 for all the tenants, including Yankee. The bomber plant is cater-corner to Hangar 1. Both are on the west side of the airport. Come 3 miles or so due east to the east side, you have our museum, which has aircraft inside and out, and the B-52, which is also outside. So we've got airplanes all over creation. Our immediate need is to replace Hangar 1, That's going to be on a to-be-determined east side of the site, although I saw a note today, I think we found a place off at Tyler Row where we're going to build it next year. Fair to say there's lots of moving pieces, costs, final resolution is TBD. As you can expect, our leadership is constantly reviewing alternatives and funding. It can't be easy. With all that said, I hope you've seen we have a wide range of aircraft, exhibits, and stories at the museum with more to come. Our long-term goal remains to move to the bomber plant with everything in one location. Remember that B-52 I showed you at the beginning of the presentation? That bad boy checks in at 175,000 pounds empty. So we gotta get it moved, and there's a specialized company in Nebraska called Worldwide Aircraft Recovery that does it. Can't be cheap, but you gotta get it, gotta move it. At that point, the theory is Yankee will be renamed the National Museum of Aviation Technology at historic Willow Run. This is the inside of the building in 2015. This two-dimensional shot doesn't do any justice at all to the size and scope of the bomber plant. Generally, it's not open to the public, but if you ever see that there's an open house there, which once or twice a year we might have it, it's worth coming over just to see it, even if you have no interest in the Yankee Air Museum, just to think about the bomber plant itself, of what went on there and how big it is. And this is 144,000 square feet out of 3.5 million. So this is the teeniest, tiniest sliver you can imagine. We will be, assuming we can pull this off, the next generation after Ford, Kaiser, Fraser, and General Motors using the plant. Extensive work's been done since this picture was taken, much more to do. We've received generous support from the community, local labor unions, and businesses. We used to give out completion dates, and we gave up on that. I always say now it's fundraising dependent. Some days it seems like a long shot. Where's the money going to come from? Going back to 1981, the museum's overcome all sorts of obstacles, so I'm confident by hook or by crook, one way or the other, we'll do that. Now, of course, if Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates decide to walk in Saturday and write us a check, that'd help, but our strategy is not dependent on those guys. This is an artist's rendition of our future home, all subject to change. To be fair to say, I've just scratched the surface of the story. Found out from our volunteer people, we had 54,000 volunteer hours were contributed in 2018 alone. And I've often thought about why people will donate limitless amounts of time, money, and effort to preserve these aircraft and their stories. One of our volunteers is a guy named John Marker. John told me his father was a B-24 gunner in World War II, and he said, we come every week to preserve our heritage and what our fathers went through in the war. The real bonus is all the great people that become your friends, which sounds just about right to me. Privileged to get to know some of the, tell you some of the stories in the museum's history. Be glad to answer any questions. Be glad to sell you a book, 20 bucks, sign it afterwards. That'd be all great, but if nothing else, come on down sometime for a tour, whether it's with me or one of the other docents. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thanks for your time.